Hello, I think I'm live. Oh, hey, there I am. I am 5 seconds into study session number three. Three, a bit better lighting here. Sorry for the delay. Not that there's anybody on here right now, but hopefully you all will get to watch and listen later, and this will help you out as you get to watch such things. So we're talking about the progressive era. The progressive era is called the progressive era because things are progressing, things are getting better, right? Things are, most people, their lives stunk. Things were bad in the factories. Things were bad for farmers. Things were bad for most people. If you weren't an industrial entrepreneur, industrialist, then things just were not good for you at all. And therefore, you wanted your life to get better. And as the wealth starts to grow and people start to make a little bit of money, they realize, hey, I don't want life to suck anymore. So we need to do things like strikes and stuff like that in order to get better. And we talked about different regions and how these things were bad and how things start getting better in these different regions. We started out, tonight we're going to start out with the South. Okay, we talked about what led up to the Civil War. We talked about a little bit of the Civil War, and right after the Civil War, we have this thing called Reconstruction, and Reconstruction was I don't know, have any words to describe it. It was good for a little while, and then there was a compromise, and things got bad. But mostly, what we're talking about is right after Reconstruction and how the Jim Crow South came to be, and what were the things that were happening there. So first of all, remember that that once the Jim Crow laws start to take full effect, the way they are enforced, the way that the laws are enforced is the lynchings, right? People get lynched if you break a Jim Crow law as an African American back in the day. You got lynched. It was the whole town would come out. There are several pictures of people getting lynched in the city streets with all kinds of people watching, children, policemen, everybody watching. It was a big event, and it was one of those things. It's a sad time in American history. We have no idea how many people died in this lynchings during this time. It was a terrible, terrible thing. And there are two civil rights leaders that come out of during this time. The first two civil rights leaders in American history. You got Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois, depends on who you ask. And these two guys had two very different philosophies. Washington was the oldest. He was one of the first civil rights. He's the first African American to be invited to the White House as a human and not a servant or a slave or anything like that. And Booker T. Washington meets with Teddy Roosevelt, and he believes that African Americans need to earn their way to civil rights, that they need to be working really hard in order to earn their civil rights. He's like, drop a bucket. His famous line is, drop a bucket down to us. You drop the bucket down, and then we will move up if you just help us out just a little bit. That was his philosophy. And then W.E.B. Du Bois, his philosophy was completely different, right? His philosophy was, you have to earn. His philosophy, you're not, the African Americans aren't here, and we have to earn our way up. No, we're equal. We're humans, and we're equal, and therefore we need to demand that we have those equal rights that the Declaration of Independence, that the Constitution gives us. We have those rights. Why can people just take it away because they are racist? And he says, so he thinks that education is a big deal and that people should get educated. African Americans specifically should get educated in college and become doctors and professions and things like that. Whereas Booker T thinks that they can still just work in the fields and things like that. And eventually, if they just keep working hard, they can earn the respect of the white man. Know what the 14th Amendment is? There are a lot of amendments on this test. So this is something that you really need to study and make sure you have them separated. But the first one is the 14th Amendment that you need to know. You also need to know the 15th Amendment, the 16th Amendment, 17th, 18th. No, we don't need the 18th, but you need to know the 19th. So those are the amendments that I'm not going to go over all of them, but you need to make sure you know those amendments as we go through those things. Let's see here. I'm going through some. Make sure you know what the Compromise of 1877 is. Okay, this was all on a timeline. If you make sure you study that timeline that we did in class, I gave you a timeline. Make sure you identify the things. You have one for the South and the West. It's really going to help you if you memorize that timeline. I mean, that's timeline specifically for the test for you to study. But the Compromise of 1877, this is what virtually ends Reconstruction. The compromise is that the Democrats at the South would allow a Republican president as long as they would end Reconstruction and let them take over. This is when Jim Crow laws take full effect, because the old Confederate leaders are now in charge and not the federal government. So the federal government isn't enforcing the federal rules, and now the Southerners just kind of ignore these new amendments, the 14th, 15th, all these amendments that African Americans got for that. So that's the Compromise of 1877. Like I said earlier, the 15th Amendment is very important for you to know. Make sure you know Plessy Ferguson. Okay, Plessy Ferguson creates separate but equal, and this really kind of legalizes the Jim Crow South, and it's going to be that way until Brown v. Board. But Plessy v. Ferguson definitely does that, and it's a very bad thing. It creates segregation, legalizes it pretty much. Let's see here, going through the test questions. Okay. Hold on one second. We'll do so the next one. So that was the South. Make sure you know those things about the South, the amendments, the compromise, Jim Crow laws. Make sure you know what a Jim Crow law is, all those wonderful things. But then the next region we talked about was the West. And we talked about what are the opportunities and what are some of the things that that was happening in the West. I'm sorry, my computer's being weird. Plus, I mean, well, it wouldn't be a Lemons study video session if we didn't have an awkward pause where I'm trying to fill time and I just want to preview the test. Unfortunately, I accidentally signed out again because I'm a silly goose. And I think we're back in 3, 2. Here we are. So now remember, it's the West. Okay, so the West is this basically unknown frontier, and we have a couple problems out in the West for white Americans to settle out west. First of all, there's no transportation out there, so you have to ride the wagons. Think about the Oregon Trail. If you ever played the Oregon Trail back in the day, that was obviously not a luxurious trip or anything. A lot of people died doing that. So that was one way. The railroads are going to fix that problem. So once the railroad and all those things start to go out there, it's easier for people to go out there. So once we have transportation fixed, then the next problem is we have the Native Americans that are out there on land that Americans want for mostly gold and things. So people would find gold and they'd have a gold rush and they'd take these Indians' land and eventually push them on reservations. There was even government incentives to kill the buffalo in order to starve out the Indians. We did some terrible things. They made the Jim Crow law in the South, that was a black mark on American history, and the Native American, what we did to the Native Americans is absolutely a black mark on American history. Absolutely terrible, terrible things that we do there. But as we push these Native Americans to reservations, they start getting more desperate, and we have what we call the Indian Wars. Which wasn't really a war, more massacres here and there, but the Indians did fight back. And one of the battle that you need to know is the Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of Little Bighorn, or also called Greasy Grass. This is the biggest victory. This is kind of the height of the Indian Wars. The Indians kind of had their mother base there, and Custer was a complete moron and decided to attack the base and just completely decimated Custer. The Indians just absolutely decimate this fella, and that was kind of the height for the Indians as far as that goes, was Greasy Grass and all that stuff. Other opportunities for the West is, especially for African Americans, was becoming cowboys. They could go out, join the army was one thing, and then but the biggest thing is a lot of people They could go join the army. They could be cowboys. They could help build new towns. I mean, there's just a ton of opportunities, and people saw them as humans and not as property out west because they needed to get these things done. So it didn't matter the color of your skin. So there's a lot of opportunities for African Americans out west as cowboys, joining the army, helping construction, building a new town, or things like that. Really helped out a lot of people there. Another thing about the West is make sure you know. So once we start, the gold rush happens, and once we start settling these things, and like I mentioned earlier, the buffalo, right? So the buffalo is kind of another problem, and we think, well, we'll kill two birds with one stone. We'll kill the buffalo, which will starve out the Indians. And the way that we do this, I'm sorry to mention this earlier, the way we do this, we ride the railroads. These people ride railroads, and they'll go out west, jump off the railroad, shoot as many buffalo as possible. And as they shoot all the buffalo, they take out their tongues, rip off their skin, and then they get back on the trains and they kill millions of buffalo. I can't remember the stat because I can never remember the stat, but I mean, we were down to like hundreds of buffalo at one time. Today we have a couple thousand buffalo. Most of them are in Yellowstone Park, but this was a thing that was a government. I mean, the government paid people to go out and slaughter these buffaloes off of trains and things like that. And as this starts happening, and as the Indians are being pushed to reservations, remember, and their natural resources are being taken out, and with the exhaustion of their natural resources, they get more desperate, and that's when you get Indian wars, and then eventually they would have to give up and just move to the reservation life and get the terrible things that happen there. Another thing is one of the most famous cattle ranch and cattle routes was called the Santa Fe Trail. So when the Santa Fe Trail closes, that's just a big symbolism. Like that is the end of the age of the cowboys, and it really starts to show that the West is really becoming settled. That there's not a lot of explored, non-settled land out west anymore. There's trains, there's towns, and the West has suddenly become this. It's not the wild frontier anymore. It's just part of America. It's just a place where people live and people go, things like that. So the Santa Fe Trail was this major route for cattle ranchers and cattle drivers, and that Santa Fe Trail closing pretty much represents the end of the cowboys. The cowboys are over. That and the fence, the barbed wire fence, really just pretty much ends anything that the cowboys have. And then after this, after you settle the transportation and the Native Americans and all those things, the big question is you got to have access to water, right? Out west, there's not a lot of water, so having access to water is going to be a major factor in settling the West. It's really, I've seen where people say, really the story of the West is the story of people finding water. If they could find water, then they could settle in those places. One of the most famous water pipelines to go to Los Angeles. We wouldn't have Los Angeles today if it wasn't for this huge water pipeline that drained this fresh water to give to Los Angeles. It's a pretty crazy story there. And really the West has opportunity. Okay, there's a lot of opportunity out west for a lot of people with the Homestead Act and those things. So that's kind of the story of the West and how we settled things in the West. And then, so we have the South. We talked about the South. We talked about the West. And now we're going to talk about progressivism just as a whole. Okay, and we have a couple little things that happen that's considered a progressive movement. First of all is the 19th Amendment. When women are granted the right to vote, there are, we talk about the cool stories there, but as women, right before they got to vote, there's a weird thing that kind of happens is you have single women and you have married women. Single women have more opportunities. Married women are kind of stuck to what to their jobs at the factory. They have to, they're settled down trying to provide for their families and everything. And then you have the single women who have more opportunities, are able to go out and do more things for that. Now, connecting to the West, okay, of course, in the women's rights, you have the Harry Burns story that I told you. Make sure you know that, and how they really fought for that, for their right to vote. And once they win that right to vote for women, they're really fighting for equal rights after that. So all these women groups that fought so hard to get that vote, they win. They're like, hey, now we got to keep fighting here. And eventually, a lot of this stuff evolved into modern day feminism as they do those things. The next movement that we're talking about is populism. I remember populism was a lot of these farmers out west and farmers in the south. But they had a lot of conflict between the two because the farmers in the south were kind of typically the segregationist, and the farmers out west kind of weren't. They were a little bit more liberal in their thoughts there. And so this populist movement is these they're gathering together. Right? These farmers are finally banding together with the Granger movement and the American Federation. No, that was a. Don't listen to that. It was the Granger movement that built this coalition of farmers to help create a populist movement. And a lot of reason why they did this was because they were just kind of sick of the two political parties. They realized that they could make some change on their own, but in order to make real change, they were going to have to make political change, and they were going to have to do things politically. So they create their own political party called the Populism Party. And a lot of reason why they did that, they just didn't like the other two parties. They weren't very excited about the Republican or the Democrat Party. And things start getting even worse, right? Debt starts making things look bad, decline in agriculture, and the economic climate during this is just really bad. That helps farmers decide, hey, we've really got to join together here, and we've got to create change within our group, but we got to create government change. We need the government to help us create this change. So because of this long-term decline in agricultural prices, that's why they do this, to do this. Most of the populist support came from small-scale farmers. These industrial farmers, they were kind of already, as industrial farming starts to happen, they were kind of tied in with the industrialists. So it's these small scale farmers that are just trying to make a living that start to really band together and help each other out for that. Let's see here. Let me scroll through here a little bit. So I think that's all we have on populism. If there's another populist question, I'll bring it back up. But then, so in the cities, so you have the South doing their thing, the West doing their thing, and populism being created there. Then you have the North. And what's happening in the North in the progressive age? Well, first you have somebody called muckrakers. Remember, muckrakers are journalists or authors or artists that are trying to expose corruption. They're exposing corruption in government. They're exposing corruption in big business. Anywhere they see that something needs to change, they are going to try to find it and change. I had a list for you guys to know certain muckrakers: Jacob Riis, Ida Tarbell. Make sure you know those people, study those people and kind of what they were trying to expose and what they were trying to expose and what they were trying to get changed from something really bad. Then you have like movements like the Settlement House that we talked about. The Settlement House was just trying to solve the problems of living in the city. These people were living in terrible conditions, and the settlement houses was a way to provide a safe housing for poor people. And this kind of would eventually evolve into what we call government housing today. The private person tried to fix it, and the government's like, oh, that's a pretty good idea. And they eventually kind of take over with that. Let's see here. Another big movement during this time is the voting rights. Okay, so a lot of people they had the right to vote, but they didn't have the right to vote on a lot of stuff. So a big movement in the progressive era was allowing people to vote for different things, allowing people to vote and have more power. So you have things like referendum, initiative referendum, and all these things, recall. These things were designed to take power away from the elite and give power to the people. It's a very Donald Trump populist kind of political movement. In order to, we're going to take power away from the political elites and give it back to the normal person. Um, and of course, we talked about civil rights already a little bit, talking about the South. But know that, in the progressive era, really, there's a lot of movement um, for people for civil rights, except the government doesn't really do anything. There's not really a president that's a big champion for civil rights. Um, Teddy Roosevelt brings in Booker T. Washington into the White House, and that's a pretty big deal. And it looks like that he's going to kind of be fighting for civil rights, and he kind of doesn't really do that much with it after that. But they really don't get a lot of government support, so it's very important to know that the civil rights movement of that time doesn't get a lot of government support at all. Make sure you know Woodrow Wilson, Taft, and Roosevelt. Make sure you know that those three guys, kind of the task rotation, those tasks that I gave you in those task rotation are designed straight from test questions. All right, so if you completed those, go back and study those. Look at Wilson's achievements, like the Federal Reserve Act. Look at Teddy Roosevelt's achievements, like the meat inspection, the Pure Food and Drug Act. Make sure kind of the progressive acts that each of these presidents have. Let's see here. We already did these questions here, so we should be good there. Let's see. I think we are. No, so going back to women, I gave you a couple of women's organizations like the Women's Club. Make sure you know that the Women's Club, what those organizations were all about. Also know that when women kind of remember right after we talked about the big push for women. A lot of things that help is that after World War I, women had a lot of jobs because all the men were off fighting the war. And this gave a lot of women independence that they had never had before. So they wanted to keep this independence after the war in order to, they liked buying things. They liked doing things and not have to depend on other people. And since they didn't want to depend on other people, this creates this movement for women to be able to have a job and to have a profession and to go to school and learn different things in order for them to make their own destiny. This is for a lot of women. This is the first time that women really had a choice in creating their own destiny. And when this movement kind of starts happening, though, a lot of business people say, they don't want to go back home and take care of children. This is just going to be a fad. So that kind of worked out for their advantage a little bit, right? Because they were able to say, hey, this will be a fad. We'll let them have their fun, and then they'll want to go back in the kitchen. And then obviously that's not what happened, but that was kind of how businessmen understood this thing, that it was just kind of a temporary thing that women wanted to do. But remember that even though when we talk about women gaining a lot of rights and getting a lot of jobs and things like that, that's true except for African American women. All right, so African American women are still low on the totem pole. Pretty much the only profession African woman could have is cleaning a house, which wasn't really a profession, right? Or being, The Help, if you've ever seen the movie The Help, or if like a true profession, the only one that they could have was really be a teacher. Is they could go and be a teacher, and that was pretty much the only opportunity that African American women had at the time. So it's pretty crazy stuff. So progressive era, things are getting better, but the big overarching theme is that they're taking rights from the elites. They're taking all this power, and not rights, taking power away from the elites, giving more power to the normal American person, and trying to make life just better for people in general. We talked about all three different areas that this happened in. I feel like that is a pretty good summarization of everything that's on your test. I hope I covered most of it. I'm going to look. Okay, I don't see, what's this? Okay, I don't see that I have any questions. If there are, I'm sorry. I don't know where they're at, but it don't look like anybody's really chatting or anything like that. So I hope you all study. Hope you all have a good night. I'll see you tomorrow. You'll kill that test. It's going to be it's going to be great. As long as you study, we're going to do great. Have sweet dreams. Good night. Adios. Hasta mañana. Yada, 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 yada.